The ballroom glittered like a captured constellation, each crystal chandelier refracting the warm glow of 100 candles into a kaleidoscope that danced across satin gowns and polished boots. The air smelled faintly of lilac and smoke, mingling with the subtle perfume of anticipation and whispered judgment. In the midst of this elegant chaos stood Lord Alistair Ravenshaw, tall and immaculately composed, a man whose mere presence drew both awe and caution. His dark eyes swept the crowd with the precision of a predator, cold yet luminous, and in their depths, rumor had it, no heart dared dwell. Tonight, as on countless evenings before, he had come to observe rather than to enjoy, to reject rather than to embrace, and the assembled guests had come to witness the performance that had become his society signature, the polite yet merciless refusal of every hopeful bride. A hush rippled through the gathering as he passed, his coat brushing the polished floor, his boots echoing with a rhythmic authority that silenced idle chatter. One by one he dismissed suitors with a polite smile and a courteous bow, each refusal punctuated by a society's gasp that floated like a specter in the heated air. "He refuses them as if matrimony were a contagion," someone whispered, their voice tremulous with a mixture of awe and resentment. Another muttered, "A man untouched by sentiment, yet feared by all." The ladies, draped in layers of silk and lace, fanned themselves with delicate gestures, and some dared glance at him with a hope he would not meet. He never did. At the periphery of the spectacle, standing with a quiet dignity almost unnoticed, was Miss Eleanor Whitcombe. Her gown was modest, a soft gray that lacked the sparkle of her companions, yet it bore a quiet elegance, carefully stitched by hands she could barely afford. Her hair, dark and glossy, was braided simply and pinned high, revealing a neck that was slender but unassuming, a small beauty she had learned to carry without fanfare. She was not here as a contender for the Duke's elusive favor but as a companion to a cousin, and already she felt the sting of society's disdain. Eyes flicked her way, murmurs followed, a charity bride, no fortune, no family of note. Each whispered judgment pressed like cold iron against her chest, and she bore it with a poise that surprised even herself. Her gaze inadvertently met that of the Duke as he paused mid-step, surveying the room with his inscrutable expression. A flicker of recognition passed through her, a fleeting awareness of the weight he carried, of the distance he maintained between himself and the world. He noticed her, perhaps only as one notices a shadow at the edge of light, yet in that brief instant, something fragile and unspoken passed between them. A sigh escaped her lips, almost inaudible, and she looked away, quickly burying the moment beneath her practiced composure. The subtle drama of the evening was interrupted by the entrance of Lady Agatha Ravenshaw, the formidable matriarch of the Ravenshaw line. She moved with the precision of a queen and the authority of one accustomed to bending both men and time to her will. Her gown, deep burgundy trimmed with black lace, swept the marble floor, a living emblem of power and expectation. Eyes turned as she approached her grandson, speaking first to no one in particular, yet every word carried the weight of command. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft but edged with steel, "a man who fears attachment is already conquered." The Duke's brow furrowed, a faint shadow of something unspoken, and he inclined his head, acknowledging the invisible bonds of duty he had long resisted. She drew him aside into the marble gallery, the echoes of the ballroom fading to a hushed murmur behind them. There, in the muted glow of torchlight and polished stone, she laid forth an ultimatum that would reshape the course of the coming weeks. He would marry. Not for passion, not for whim, but for duty, inheritance, and the fragile perpetuation of family name. A single month, she commanded, or he would lose his claim to Ravenshaw estates and titles, a fate he had never before considered plausible. Alistair's jaw tightened. The world, so carefully ordered by his own hand, now pressed upon him with relentless inevitability. Meanwhile, Eleanor, still unaware of her sudden significance, lingered near the edge of the crowd, her hands clutching the folds of her gown, heart fluttering with the nervous energy of an observer who had become unwilling witness to destiny. Conversations swirled around her, a mixture of awe, gossip, and subtle malice. Yet in her mind she was not merely a spectator. She felt a quiet determination, a resolve to survive this world with integrity intact, to carry herself with a grace that would not betray fear or inadequacy. Later that evening, as the orchestra swelled and the candles flared with a golden insistence, Lady Agatha returned to the ballroom and made her announcement. Her voice rang clearly over the notes of the violins, precise and unyielding. "My grandson is to be wed. The bride has been chosen." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Women clutched their fans, men straightened their coats, and all eyes turned toward Eleanor Whitcombe. She froze, her pulse hammering like the frantic beat of a carriage horse, her modest hand tightening on her gown. In that instant, the whispers of society collided with the gravity of fate, and she realized she was no longer a mere shadow at the edge of light but the center of a storm she could scarcely comprehend. Alistair's face, usually so composed, betrayed a flicker of something rare, a darkening storm behind his eyes, a subtle tightening of lips that suggested a confrontation with a truth he had long evaded. The crowd, oblivious to the silent battle playing out in those depths, continued to gaze, breathless with curiosity and expectation. Eleanor's mind raced, each heartbeat echoing the enormity of what had just been proclaimed. A bride she had never wished to be, chosen for reasons she could not yet fathom, now entwined irrevocably with the most formidable man she had ever glimpsed. And so, as the chandeliers gleamed and the violins swelled, a fragile tension settled between them, unspoken but undeniable, a collision of duty and destiny, of pride and curiosity, of a man who had refused every bride and a woman who had never sought to be chosen. The ballroom, brilliant and perfumed, seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows of Ravenshaw Manor, carrying with it a whisper of inevitability, of change, and of a story that had only just begun. The first days at Ravenshaw Manor were a study in silence, a labyrinth of echoing halls and gilded emptiness that seemed to breathe with its own imperious will. Eleanor wandered through corridors lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes, stern and judging, followed her with the weight of generations. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and cold stone, and the faintest trace of smoke from distant hearths lent the manor a muted warmth, though it could not penetrate the chill that lingered between her and her husband. Alistair moved with habitual restraint, a shadow among the grandeur, his presence a subtle reminder that every gesture and word was calculated, controlled, deliberate. He did not speak to her more than necessary, addressed her with the formal cadence of a man unaccustomed to intimacy, and she, in turn, cultivated an elegant distance, her politeness a shield against the quiet scrutiny of his gaze. Yet even in his austerity, the first signs of unexpected attention appeared in small, almost imperceptible ways. On her first evening alone in the sitting room, she discovered a vase of winter roses set upon the polished table, their crimson petals vivid against the muted tones of the room. There was no card, no explanation, only the silent assertion that someone had considered her preferences. Eleanor ran her fingers lightly over a single bloom, inhaling the heady fragrance, a warmth rising to her cheeks at the quiet mystery of it. Later, she would learn from the servants that the Duke had personally ordered the greenhouse to be warmed so that these flowers could bloom in the frost, and when she thanked him discreetly, he merely inclined his head, his eyes dark, unreadable. There was no confession, no display, only the subtle weight of acknowledgement that left Eleanor both astonished and uneasy. The manor, however, was not free from the prying eyes of society. Rumors spread like wildfire, and Eleanor quickly became aware of her precarious position. Servants whispered in hushed tones, and distant cousins, drawn by curiosity or envy, arrived with veiled intentions. A charity bride, one wag muttered over afternoon tea, married to a man who despises sentiment. Eleanor stiffened at the remark but held her composure, remembering the lessons of quiet dignity her late parents had instilled. She would not shrink from the scrutiny, nor allow the whispered malice of others to erode her resolve. Even the public gatherings demanded a careful dance. At the first formal dinner hosted in her honor, the Duke's acquaintances tested her with veiled inquiries about her family, her upbringing, her fortune. Their words dripped with subtle derision, and Eleanor, cheeks flushed yet unyielding, replied with measured politeness, never betraying the sting of insult. Alistair, seated beside her, finally spoke in a tone that silenced the lingering murmurs. "My wife's dignity is not a topic for public recreation." The statement, precise and commanding, sent a ripple through the assembly, and Eleanor felt a fleeting surge of awe and relief. It was a protection neither tender nor affectionate, yet it carried a weight far more significant than empty flattery, recognition. Days passed in a rhythm of restraint, punctuated by moments that revealed the subtle complexities of their union. Eleanor busied herself with the estate's charities, organizing deliveries of warm clothing and provisions for the local poor, gaining respect among the household staff. Servants, once wary of her status, now regarded her with a quiet reverence, inspired by her composure and practical kindness. Alistair observed her from a distance, his eyes often lingering longer than propriety allowed, and Eleanor, aware yet hesitant, felt the faintest stirrings of curiosity and cautious hope. One evening, as twilight filtered through tall windows and painted the walls with amber and rose, Eleanor discovered another token of the Duke's unspoken attentions. A pair of leather-bound volumes, rare and finely crafted, appeared upon her desk, her favorite poetry, selections chosen with evident care. A small slip of paper bore only the words, "For quiet hours, madam." She held the note in her hand, a tremor of warmth creeping through her chest. Later, when she dared inquire, Alistair's brief acknowledgement, an almost imperceptible nod, was all the confession the moment allowed. It was a gift, yet more than a gift, a revelation of attention carefully measured, restrained, yet unmistakably present. Still, society continued its subtle assault. At a winter gathering, a former debutante, scorned and clever, insinuated that Eleanor's marriage was a strategic charity, a move to spite jealous competitors. The words, soft and venomous, would have cut deep in another. Eleanor felt the prick of shame and vulnerability but refused to bend. Alistair's sudden intervention silenced the murmurs. "She is my wife, not an object for speculation," he said, his voice low yet firm, his gaze unwavering. Eleanor glimpsed a rare vulnerability behind the control, the hint of a man who carried a burdensome need for order yet found himself defending her with uncharacteristic fervor. Later that night, Eleanor, exhausted yet unbroken, wandered into the chapel, drawn by the hush and the muted scent of candle wax and polished stone. She knelt before the altar, whispering a prayer not for her own benefit but for courage, for the fortitude to navigate the treacherous currents of her new life. She wept quietly, not for despair, but for the weight of circumstance, the fragile dignity she wished to preserve in a world that had already judged her harshly. It was then that Alistair entered, silent, unseen, and paused at the threshold. His eyes, dark and brooding, fell upon her bowed figure. For the first time he did not speak, did not step forward, did not offer the comfort his voice often commanded in society. He simply watched, and in that gaze there was a flicker of something Eleanor could not name, a recognition of struggle, a silent acknowledgement of her resilience. She did not hear him leave, but the chill of the chapel seemed to soften in the trace of his presence, leaving a subtle warmth in its place. The manor, vast and echoing, had begun to change with their presence, not in structure but in the quiet undercurrent of awareness. Eleanor's resolve, tempered by the challenges of society and the subtle attentions of her husband, had begun to carve space for herself in a world that had sought to diminish her. Alistair, too, felt a subtle shift, though neither would name it aloud. The realization that marriage, imposed or reluctant, could yield moments of connection unspoken yet profoundly altering. And so, as the last candle flickered and the wind rattled the ancient windows, Eleanor returned to her chambers with her heart full of cautious hope, yet shadowed by the looming expectation of duty. Outside, the frost-laden gardens shimmered beneath the moonlight, and somewhere beyond the stone walls of Ravenshaw Manor, the distant voices of society murmured, awaiting the unfolding of a tale that neither could yet foresee. The winter roses in the sitting room, crimson against the pale walls, seemed to whisper promises of attention, secrets, and subtle defiance, an omen that this marriage, though born of obligation, might yet bend toward something neither Alistair nor Eleanor had dared to imagine. The countryside outside Ravenshaw Manor stretched into a winter haze, a tapestry of frost-laced hedges, skeletal trees, and distant hills shrouded in silver mist. Eleanor had begged for a short ride, claiming the need for fresh air and quiet thought, and Alistair, after a brief hesitation, had allowed it, though he followed at a distance, his dark coat brushing the carriage steps, eyes ever watchful. The air carried the sharp tang of snow and pine, filling Eleanor's lungs with a bracing chill that seemed to steady her racing heart. Yet the manor's looming expectations clung to her like a shadow, whispering reminders of duty, of scrutiny, of the delicate balance she had yet to navigate with her formidable husband. The morning's serenity shattered when the carriage jolted against a hidden rut, tossing Eleanor forward in a sudden motion that left her clutching the reins with a startled gasp. She managed to bring the horse to a reluctant halt, heart hammering, and was acutely aware of Alistair's rapid approach through the frost, boots crunching in the frozen earth. "Madam," he called, voice taut yet controlled, "are you unhurt?" His dark eyes, usually unreadable, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest ache with an unfamiliar, brittle anticipation. "I am fine," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt, though the tremor in her fingers betrayed her calm. The horse merely startled. She tried to offer a composed smile, but it faltered under the weight of his gaze. He dismounted silently, his presence sudden and solid, a contrast to the frail morning mist. The air between them was taut with unspoken tension, charged with the peculiar intimacy of shared peril and mutual attention. Alistair's hand hovered near hers, uncertain, deliberate, until it finally brushed against her sleeve, a gesture both protective and hesitant. "You should not venture alone," he said, voice low, almost a murmur, yet heavy with meaning. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a flurry of heat against the winter chill, as she realized the layers of restraint she had long maintained were beginning to erode under his presence. "I wished only for clarity," she whispered, eyes meeting his for the briefest instant, and in that instant something unspoken passed. A recognition of loneliness, of unvoiced longing, of the quiet ache beneath the strictures of their respective duties. He helped her steady the horse, hands brushing hers again, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the muted sounds of the forest and the warmth of proximity that neither had acknowledged before. Eleanor dared to speak, her voice trembling with a courage she had scarcely felt. "Lord Alistair, I do not believe you refuse brides from disdain, but from something far more profound." He froze, the horse shifting beneath them, and his dark eyes darkened further, a storm gathering in the depths that neither apology nor denial could quell. They rode in silence, the frost cracking softly beneath the carriage wheels, until the path opened to a small glade, sunlight breaking weakly through the canopy, illuminating the frost-dusted earth. Here, Alistair dismounted fully, moving closer to her with a hesitance that belied his usual command. The manor, the ballroom, the whispers of society, all seemed to fall away, leaving only the brittle hush of winter and the fragile intimacy between them. "I have feared," he confessed, voice low, almost too private for the world, "that to bind myself to another is to fail them as I have failed before. My mother, my father. I swore never to become what they were, distant, unfeeling, unworthy." His admission trembled on the edge of vulnerability, a rare crack in the formidable armor he wore before the world. Eleanor's breath caught, and she stepped closer, though still mindful of decorum, of propriety, of the invisible walls that governed every gesture. "You are not them," she said softly, words deliberate, gentle. "And I do not ask for perfection. Only presence. Only that you see me as I am, not as the world would measure me." Her hands, gloved yet trembling, hovered near his, uncertain, and he did not withdraw. The distance between them was measured in heartbeats, in silent acknowledgement of the fragile trust they were beginning to weave. He swallowed hard, the cold biting at his cheeks, and finally spoke again, voice steadier but laden with unspoken meaning. "You see me? Truly, without calculation or expectation. And in that, you are unlike anyone I have known." The words, so carefully measured, struck Eleanor with the force of revelation. She felt the long-suppressed pulse of her own desire, mingled with a wary fear, that to feel so deeply could invite both solace and peril. "And yet," she murmured, "I do not wish merely to be seen. I wish to stand beside you even if the world refuses to acknowledge us, even if duty demands silence." The wind rose, shaking the branches above, scattering a swirl of frost to land upon their shoulders like fleeting diamonds. In that crystalline moment, Alistair reached for her hand, the gloved fingers brushing hers lightly, deliberately, almost as if testing the strength of the connection he dared not yet name. Eleanor's heart surged, fragile and trembling, as the contact burned through the restraint of months. They did not speak further, for words would have been inadequate, and yet in the silence lay more confession than any declaration. When they returned to the manor, the vast corridors seemed less oppressive, less frozen, though the echo of the walls still whispered of duty and expectation. Eleanor's chambers were warm, suffused with the scent of winter roses and the faint trace of the fire she had tended, yet her thoughts lingered in the glade, on the touch of his hand, on the rare glimpse of the man beneath the title, beneath the formality. Alistair, too, felt the shift, a tremor of awareness that the woman beside him, once merely a bride by obligation, had begun to reach places within him that he had thought forever closed. That night, as the manor settled into a muted hush, Eleanor knelt at her bedside, candlelight flickering across her thoughtful face. She dared to admit, if only to herself, that the presence of Alistair, the subtle attentions, the silent protections, had begun to stir something forbidden yet inescapable within her. Outside, the frost glimmered under the waning moon, a cold, merciless reminder that society would never yield quietly, that rumors would sharpen like knives, and that the delicate intimacy they had begun to cultivate remained precarious. And yet, in the quiet, Eleanor found a fragile hope, a whisper of courage, a truth unspoken yet palpable, that even in a marriage born of duty, of social expectation, of obligation, there could exist moments of profound recognition, moments in which two souls, long armored against the world, might glimpse the possibility of connection. She glanced at the winter roses, still crimson against the pale sitting-room walls, their petals glistening with dew and promise, and for the first time allowed herself to wonder, not merely at her place in the manor, but at the shape of the man beside her, and the way he had begun, almost imperceptibly, to see her in return. The London drawing-room glittered with crystal and gilt, the air thick with perfume, candle smoke, and the hum of restrained curiosity. A winter wind rattled the tall windows of Ravenshaw Manor as though insisting that even the grandest halls bow to the elements, and Eleanor, poised yet tense, felt the weight of every eye in the room as she followed her husband down the polished floorboards. The assembly of society's most exacting voices had gathered for a soiree, ostensibly to honor the Ravenshaw line, but in truth to speculate, to judge, and to test the tenuous strength of a marriage already whispered about in scandalous tones. Eleanor's gown of deep sapphire velvet, trimmed with delicate lace, caught the lamplight with each step, yet she could not ignore the small venomous glances aimed at her origins, at her modest fortune, at the very fact that she dared occupy the position of the Duke's wife. Alistair moved beside her with measured poise, his hand lightly resting near hers, never touching, yet signaling possession and protection with an imperceptible gravity. He greeted his peers with the customary bows and curt nods, his dark eyes scanning the room with that same precision which had so often unnerved hopeful debutantes. Eleanor had grown accustomed to his reserved nature, yet in these moments she observed the subtle shifts in him, the furrowed brow at a cutting remark, the slight tightening of a jaw when a jest aimed at her dignity drew too close. Though the room hummed with polite conversation, the tension was a living thing, coiling around them like smoke. The first whisper of scandal arrived with the subtle step of a rival socialite, Lady Cresswell, whose reputation for malice was nearly as well known as her beauty. She approached Eleanor with an air of concern, voice sweetened with a knife's edge. "Madam," she murmured, glancing around as if the walls themselves would overhear, "it is said the Duke may yet reconsider his choice of bride. One wonders if such a union can endure." Eleanor's spine stiffened, her pulse quickening, and she forced a serene smile, her hand brushing lightly against the folds of her gown. She could feel the heat of every gaze upon her, some sympathetic, others calculating, and the pressure of her position became almost suffocating. Alistair, ever attuned to the subtleties of society's venom, stepped forward, voice low yet slicing the murmurs like a blade. "She is my wife," he declared, his dark eyes unwavering. "Not an object for speculation, nor a topic for amusement. Any question of her worthiness reflects upon the character of the speaker, not the woman beside me." Eleanor felt her own breath catch as a ripple of silence moved through the room. It was a subtle victory, private yet public, a recognition that the man she had once feared indifferent now carried the weight of her dignity with unflinching conviction. The evening unfolded with its delicate dance of conversation and observation, yet Eleanor could not ignore the subtle glances Alistair cast her way, the way his presence seemed to shift when she passed by, and the faint curl of approval in his otherwise impassive features. At last, seeking refuge from the scrutiny, she found herself in a quieter alcove near the winter gardens, the scent of frost and evergreen mingling with the faint heat from the drawing-room hearth. Alistair followed, his steps measured, deliberate, yet with a tension she had come to recognize as the prelude to confession. "You have endured much," he said, voice low, carrying across the narrow space between them. "The whispers, the insinuations, and yet you remain unbroken. I did not anticipate such resilience." Eleanor's chest tightened, for she understood the weight of his observation. It was no mere courtesy, but acknowledgment of the woman he had once disregarded, now seen fully in her strength. "I endure because there is no other path," she replied, her tone firm yet quiet, "and because I will not allow society to define me. Not now, not ever." He studied her with a dark intensity that sent a tremor through her, an almost tangible current of recognition and longing. "You have altered the course of this house, of me," he murmured, voice thick with emotion he rarely permitted. "Your presence commands attention, not through vanity but through integrity. I have begun to realize the enormity of what I have gained in you." Eleanor's hands, gloved but trembling, found his briefly, the contact electric yet careful, measured. She could feel the subtle shift, the movement from duty to something far more intimate, a recognition of shared vulnerability that neither had dared name before. The climax of the evening came unbidden as Lady Cresswell, emboldened by the faintly uneasy silence, attempted one last thrust, raising a toast with artful malice. "To the Duke's bride," she intoned, voice honeyed yet sharp, "may she endure as well as she dazzles, for endurance, we all know, is far more telling than beauty alone." A ripple of laughter and polite applause followed, yet Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of observation pressing upon her fragile composure. Before she could respond, Alistair lifted his hand, silencing the murmurs with a gesture that was as commanding as it was deliberate. "Endurance is indeed telling," he said, his voice low, rich, carrying across the room with authority that brooked no dispute. "Yet I find it far more remarkable when that endurance is paired with courage, dignity, and a quiet strength that defies the judgments of others. My wife possesses all of these and more. Let there be no question of her worth, for it is beyond measure." The room fell into near silence, eyes darting between the couple, some in awe, some in reluctant acknowledgement, and Eleanor felt a surge of heat and relief she could scarcely contain. Alistair's hand finally brushed hers again, lightly, almost imperceptibly, yet with an undeniable claim of intimacy. Eleanor's pulse leapt, for in that fleeting touch lay a promise unspoken but understood. The world might scorn, might judge, might whisper endlessly, yet here in the midst of scrutiny, they had established a private dominion of mutual recognition and defiance. The scandal that had threatened to define her now bowed before the quiet ferocity of a man who had once rejected all brides and now refused to allow his own to be diminished. As the evening drew to a close, and the candles guttered with golden exhaustion, Eleanor stood by the terrace, looking out at the frost-covered gardens glinting beneath the moonlight. The wind carried a chill that brushed her cheek like a lover's whisper, and she felt the subtle weight of possibility settle upon her shoulders. Alistair stepped beside her, his presence solid, unwavering, yet not yet intrusive. For a moment, they simply regarded the frozen landscape, silent but wholly aware of the shifts between them, the acknowledgement, the attention, the growing, unspoken devotion. Finally he spoke, voice low and intimate, meant only for her. "Tonight has confirmed what I feared and what I hoped. That a woman such as you could not merely endure, but compel me to see what I have long refused to acknowledge, that love, however delayed, can shape even the hardest of hearts." Eleanor turned to meet his gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes mirrored in her own, and for the first time, the boundaries of duty and expectation felt less like chains and more like a stage upon which their connection could quietly flourish. And as the manor exhaled its long ancient sigh, Eleanor understood, with a mix of awe and apprehension, that the next chapter of their lives, fraught with expectation, scandal, and uncharted intimacy, had begun. Winter roses, crimson against the frost, awaited in the sitting room, silent witnesses to the fragile, daring possibility of what had begun between them, yet still hinting at the trials and revelations to come. The dawn broke over Ravenshaw Manor like liquid gold, spilling across frost-laden gardens and illuminating the intricate lattice of ice that clung to every branch and railing. Eleanor rose from her chambers, the sunlight casting a soft glow upon her pale cheeks, and moved quietly through the corridors, each step measured, mindful of the hush that lingered after the grandeur of the previous evening. The manor itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable reckoning that would unfold between its most formidable occupants. Alistair had been awake long before her, she suspected, his dark silhouette already visible through the frosted window, gazing at the gardens with a precision that bespoke both contemplation and quiet longing. Their breakfast was a quiet affair, the clink of silver against china filling the room with a domesticity neither had yet fully embraced. Eleanor caught the subtle tension in Alistair's posture, the rigid control he maintained even while performing such ordinary tasks, and she marveled at the duality of the man she had come to know. Disciplined, formidable, yet capable of moments of quiet attentiveness that no observer could truly measure. He met her eyes only briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement, before his gaze returned to the gardens, as if seeking to frame the world in order before confronting the private storm within. The post-breakfast hours passed in delicate navigation. Eleanor tended to the household accounts, a small rebellion of autonomy that allowed her hands and mind to occupy themselves while her thoughts continually returned to the unspoken, to the fragile intimacies that had begun to stir between her and her husband. Alistair, in turn, reviewed the estate's matters, yet she sensed that his attention frequently strayed, the calculated motions of his hands betraying a preoccupation that had little to do with ledgers or correspondence. There was an unspoken acknowledgement hovering in the room, taut and waiting, as if both of them knew that the quiet, orderly morning would soon yield to revelation. It was late afternoon when Alistair appeared in her study, his boots muted against the polished floorboards, his coat brushed with the chill of the gardens. Eleanor rose immediately, though she did not step back. "Madam," he said, voice even yet carrying a depth of gravity that made her pulse quicken, "may I have a word in private?" She nodded, scarcely daring to breathe, and led him to the drawing room, the expanse of windows catching the waning sunlight and casting their elongated shadows across the polished oak floor. He moved to stand beside her, close yet respectful, and for a long moment they simply regarded each other, the room filled with the faint scent of winter roses from the adjoining alcove. "Eleanor," he began, the single utterance of her name more intimate than any flourish of language, "I have spent months defending a world in which no one could harm you, yet in doing so, I have realized that I have allowed walls to rise between myself and everything I might have cherished." His gaze met hers fully, dark, unyielding, yet softened by the rare vulnerability he had long denied the world. She felt a tremor of anticipation, a fragile mix of fear and hope as she whispered, "And what have you learned, Alistair?" The use of his name, unprefaced by title or distance, was deliberate, a small act of rebellion against the decorum that had always governed them. "I have learned," he replied, voice low and steady, "that I am not the man I feared I would become. That my heart, long thought incapable of yielding, may still recognize courage, integrity, and love, in ways I could not have foreseen." Eleanor's hands, gloved yet quivering, brushed lightly against his, a silent invitation, and he did not withdraw. Instead, he closed the final space between them, and the tension that had been simmering for months boiled into a single, undeniable reality. The walls they had erected to protect themselves were crumbling, and what remained was raw, intimate, and irreversible. The revelation was interrupted by a servant's discreet announcement. Lady Agatha requested Eleanor in her chambers. Heart-hammering, Eleanor excused herself, leaving Alistair momentarily, only to find the matriarch seated with an intensity that bespoke both expectation and satisfaction. "My dear," Lady Agatha began, her tone softened but firm, "I chose you not out of duty nor out of whim, but because I recognized the strength required to stand beside him. You have endured, and now he sees you as he should, indispensable." Eleanor absorbed the words with a mix of relief and awe, understanding fully that the approval of the matriarch, formidable as it was, carried weight beyond measure. Returning to the drawing room, Eleanor found Alistair waiting, the afternoon light now softened by approaching dusk. "The matriarch has spoken," she said quietly, "and in doing so has confirmed what I suspect you already know, that our connection is no longer mere obligation." He inclined his head, a faint smile breaking the austere line of his features, and at last, the moment they had long deferred arrived. Alistair stepped closer, his hand covering hers with deliberate intent. "Eleanor," he said, voice trembling only slightly with unaccustomed vulnerability, "I did not believe in permanence. I feared love because it demands surrender, yet I find myself compelled by you. By your courage, your integrity, your unwavering presence." Eleanor's breath caught, a fragile shiver passing through her as the weight of his words settled into the marrow of her being. "You do not speak lightly," she whispered, voice low, measured, yet carrying the tremor of emotion. "And I do not ask you to. Only that you be honest." "I have never been more honest in my life," he said, dropping to one knee, a gesture both reverent and audacious, the firelight glinting across his features. "I do not love you out of duty or obligation or convenience. I love you because you have altered the shape of my soul, because you have forced me to confront the parts of myself I long denied. Will you continue this journey with me, Eleanor, not as a bride of obligation, but as my partner, my equal, my heart?" Tears, long held in check, shone in Eleanor's eyes. She reached for him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders, feeling the weight of the man she had grown to know and in secret to cherish. "Alistair," she whispered, "I have walked through whispers, scorn, and expectation to stand here. I choose you not because I must, but because I will. I choose you entirely." The manor seemed to exhale, the frost-laden gardens outside sparkling as if in celebration, the firelight dancing across the walls and gilded frames, illuminating the intimacy of a moment long deferred. Alistair lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss first to one, then the other, reverent yet electric, a declaration both personal and defiant to the world beyond. They stood together, finally, not as distant figures bound by obligation, but as a union forged in resilience, respect, and undeniable passion. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, carrying whispers of frost and promise, while within, Ravenshaw Manor bore witness to a transformation both subtle and profound. A man who had refused every bride and a woman who had endured every scrutiny now faced the future united, their hearts entwined, their courage and love finally unshackled. As night fell, Eleanor wandered to the terrace once more, gazing at the frost-encrusted roses that had witnessed months of quiet attention, subtle gestures, and unspoken confessions. Alistair joined her silently, slipping his hand into hers, the touch no longer tentative but claiming. The winter wind brushed their faces, a reminder that the world beyond the manor's walls remained demanding, judgmental, and relentless. But they faced it together, unwavering, their shared strength and unspoken promise of both defiance and devotion. And in that moment, beneath the glimmering stars, the frost, and the sentinel roses, Eleanor understood fully. Love had arrived not as a sudden conflagration, but as a patient, enduring flame, capable of thawing even the coldest hearts, reshaping destinies, and rendering the world irrelevant to those who chose to stand together.